Okay, let's jump right into it. Today, we are taking a hard look at an explainer that dismantles a pretty dangerous yet incredibly common assumption about how humanity reacts to existential threats. We're talking about what happens when basic survival logic completely overrides our ability to coordinate as a collective. Let's get straight into the data.
So, you know that comforting idea we all kind of lean on? The assumption that stabilizing our world's weapons and endangered resources will automatically prevent a regression to the Stone Age? We naturally just assume that collective stabilization is a shared human priority, right? We think if you just show people the danger, the hard data on resource scarcity, the literal threat of systemic failure, well, everyone's going to put aside their differences and coordinate to prevent a total collapse. It feels perfectly logical. But the fatal flaw here, and it's a huge one, is assuming that every single psychological profile interprets that warning signal in the exact same way.
And we can immediately shatter that assumption with some really hard data. Pulling from the SDTEST global database, this is across 56 countries, 15 languages, with a sample size of 331, there is a verified positive correlation of 0.0379 between the fear of a massive regression to Stone Age beginnings and what spiral dynamics calls the red vMEME. Now, the red stage is that impulsive, power-driven, pure survival-oriented phase of human psychology. Statistically speaking, this meets strict reliability criteria. But remember, correlation does not mean causation. What it does reveal, though, is profound. For the red value system, the prospect of a massive societal regression isn't actually seen as a collective tragedy. Actually, it's viewed as a calculated survival mechanism.
Look at how this breaks down. This maps out what we call the algebra of conscience. And it proves mathematically that different psychological profiles take the exact same crisis and interpret it in entirely divergent ways. Green, right there at the top, is deeply community-oriented. They experience the threat as this unfolding collective trauma, and they are terrified of it. Orange, the achiever, the market-driven mindset, actually shows a negative correlation, basically assuming the market will just self-correct. Yellow, our systemic thinkers, they focus on finding complex pathways out. Meanwhile, the purple system actively resists those complex solutions, retreating instead to traditional safety. And then there's red, operating on pure survival logic. The exact same warning signal goes into the system, but the behavioral output is totally fragmented.
Dr. Clare W. the pioneer behind this whole developmental framework, modeled exactly this. He showed that under extreme pressure, our shared reality doesn't hold together. It actually splinters into three distinct, mutually exclusive pathways for the future. Pathway 1 is that massive regression back to our Stone Age beginnings. Pathway 2 is an Orwellian 1984 scenario, basically a tyrannical government imposing strict order just to keep the chaos at bay. And the third pathway is the emergence of a second-tier approach, a highly evolved, integrative response that finally moves beyond tribalism, where we can act locally and plan globally at the same time. These aren't just random guesses. These are the predictable destinations of a system under immense stress, entirely depending on which value system grabs the wheel.
So, here is the absolute crux of the issue. When you remove collective stabilization as a shared, agreed-upon goal, things get incredibly dangerous. To a red-dominant mindset, stabilization demands actually feel like constraints on their personal power. They literally don't want the system stabilized if it means they stay stuck at the bottom. So what do? They exploit the vacuum. Red views the ensuing chaos not as a failure of foresight, but as pure leverage. It's a dominance opportunity. And this is where most strategic planning utterly fails. It assumes coordination will naturally improve during a crisis, completely missing the fact that red is playing a totally different game.
And that divergent interpretation triggers a devastating butterfly effect across the entire global system. When survival calculus completely replaces coordination logic, the invisible social fabric simply tears. And it isn't always explosive either. Often, trust just silently evaporates between these competing value systems. Because red sees an opportunity for dominance, resource competition shifts from collaborative management into a brutal zero-sum game. Consequently, the diplomatic frameworks designed by the blue and green systems, they completely fail. They rely on shared rules that red simply does not respect. Meanwhile, the early warning systems designed to prevent the crisis in the first place are quietly defunded, or just ignored for being too alarmist.
It's really crucial to understand that this systemic breakdown isn't some dramatic, overnight explosion that you see coming from a mile away. It is a silent, phase-by-phase drift. It starts on day one with fragmentation, people retreating into their comfortable ideological silos. Then, by week 4, it devolves into tribal competition, where all those latent biases are activated. Fast forward to month 3, you get weaponization, where resources are hoarded and actively used against neighboring groups. And finally, by month 6, irreversible collapse. It's a literal chain reaction, where the loss of trust leads to a total legitimacy crash of our governing structures.
But wait, it's not all doom and gloom. Here is where we actually find some hope. By understanding these thousands of distinct cross-stage patterns, we can build dynamic programming models to mathematically forecast these fractures before they permanently destroy a system's legitimacy. If we know for a fact that red-dominant systems will seek dominance, while orange seeks competitive advantage, and green gets paralyzed by collective trauma, we can actually calculate the state vector of our society. We're essentially mapping the exact direction our collective psychology is pulling us. We can treat these reactions not as unpredictable, messy human feelings, but as a rigorous mathematical framework to navigate straight through the crisis.
And this perfectly tees up a massive technological trend we're seeing projected for 2026, AI vibe coding. This is where users instruct large language models using tools like Claude Code or Cursor in natural language to build complex apps and interfaces without needing any traditional code. Take this SD Navigator dashboard, for example. It processes the algebra of conscience in real time. By using prompts that are spiral literate, meaning the AI actually understands these underlying value systems, policymakers can surface the hidden structural conflicts that humans naturally just miss. The AI can simulate the future state of a system based on how an action will be refracted through the red, green, or orange mindsets. That allows us to engineer interventions that actually stabilize the system rather than accidentally fracturing it even further.
So I want to leave you with this provocative question to really mull over when you look at your own organizations and communities. What breaks when different value systems interpret the exact same existential threat through totally incompatible survival logics? And why do some see a collapse to be feared while others see an opportunity to be seized? The math clearly shows us that true stability cannot be achieved by just asking everyone to nicely get along. It requires engineering solutions that deeply understand and account for the hidden primal wiring of every single value system sitting at the table. Thanks for joining me to explore the algebra of our collective conscience. Stay curious and keep questioning the assumptions beneath the surface.